Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a door somewhere beneath the Imperium's feet that nobody talks about. Not because it is secret exactly, though secrecy is certainly part of it. Not because nobody knows it exists, though most people who might ask about it will never receive an honest answer. It goes unspoken because the things standing on the other side of it are so thoroughly beyond ordinary comprehension that even the most learned minds in the galaxy, the Aeldari Farseers who have lived for thousands of years, the scholars of the Black Library who spend lifetimes cataloguing horrors, the Inquisitors who have made it their life's work to know what ordinary Imperial citizens are never permitted to know, have decided, almost universally, that it is simply better not to go down that road. The door in question is the Webway, or rather, the deep Webway, on the parts of it that glow with something other than the familiar light of the known paths, the corridors that even the Harlequins, those acrobatic and fearless servants of the laughing god, who walk the labyrinthine tunnels like they own them, step around carefully. The branches that have been sealed with runes of psychic power so strong that the sealing itself took centuries to complete, and which are maintained by the dim and desperate hope that whatever is inside them will never, ever find a way out. This is a story about one of the largest structures in the known galaxy, a hyperdimensional network that reaches across the entire span of the Milky Way and then deeper into places that may not even exist in the same relationship to time and space as the universe you think you know. It is a story about who built it, who broke it, how many ways it has been broken, and what came to fill the spaces left behind when the light went out and the tunnels fell silent. It is, in many ways, a story about the nature of loss, the kind of loss that accumulates over millions of years, the kind that leaves behind not just absence, but something stranger and far more dangerous than ordinary emptiness. And it is a story about why, when you look at a map of the 41st millennium, and trace the routes that the various powers of the galaxy use to move through space, there are enormous regions of the Webway that nobody marks, nobody discusses, and nobody goes to. Not the Aeldari, who built it, and who understand it better than anyone still living. Not the Dark Eldar, or who have made their home in its deepest accessible chambers, and who have more reason than most to understand what lies further in. Not the Harlequins, who know it better than either of those factions. Not the Imperium, which never truly had access to begin with, and has been trying to pretend that fact does not matter ever since. Nobody. Just silence and sealed doors, and the faint and terrible sense that something on the other side is pressing very gently against the lock. So settle in, take a slow, calm breath, and let the world outside fade away for a while, because we are going somewhere that almost nobody has come back from to tell the tale, and the journey begins a very, very long time ago. Section 1. What the Webway actually is. Before you can understand why the deep Webway is so dangerous, what you need to understand what the Webway actually is in the first place. And the honest answer, the one that the lore gives you if you dig deep enough, is that even the beings who built it do not fully understand it anymore. What was once a masterwork of near infinite precision has become something closer to a haunted house that has been slowly collapsing for 60 million years, with each new disaster taking out another wing, sealing off another corridor, leaving behind rooms that nobody has seen the inside of since the age when gods walked the stars, and the concept of a galaxy-spanning civilization was not yet even an aspiration. The Webway exists in the space between two things that most sentient beings in the 41st millennium know well, or at least know of. On one side, you have real space, the material universe. As for the stars and planets and void, you could theoretically visit with a ship and enough fuel and time. On the other side, you have the warp, the immaterium, the roiling ocean of psychic energy that underlies all of creation, like the dream beneath the dreamer. Chaotic and beautiful, and absolutely lethal in the ways that matter most. The warp is not simply a metaphor for chaos, it is a dimension of pure psychic energy, constituted by the emotional and mental output of every living being in the universe. shaped and reshaped by those outputs in ways that make it responsive to thought, in the same way that water is responsive to motion. You disturb it by existing near it. You disturb it more profoundly by thinking and feeling. And what it produces in response to disturbance are the things that have been trying to get through to real space for as long as real space has existed. The Webway does not belong to either of these places. It sits between them, occupying what might be described as a thin layer of reality that presses against both surfaces without quite touching either one. It is hyperdimensional in the precise sense that it does not exist in the same 3 spatial dimensions, plus time, that you are used to. The tunnels of the Webway, when they are intact, are composed of a material that is neither fully physical nor fully psychic, a substance that resists the churning energies of the warp through some combination of construction technique and innate psychic shielding that even the most advanced minds in the current age cannot fully replicate or even fully analyze. Think of it like a series of glass tunnels running through an enormous aquarium. The aquarium is the warp, dark and turbulent and full of things, with teeth that have been pressed against the glass for as long as the glass has existed. The tunnels run through it, and if you are inside a tunnel and the glass is intact, you are safe, or at least considerably safer than you would be if you were simply swimming in the water. You can see the things pressing their faces against the glass from outside, and they can see you, but they cannot reach you. And if you know the layout of the tunnel network, you can travel from one end of the aquarium to the other without getting wet. The tunnels vary enormously in size. Some are narrow enough that only a single person can pass through at a time. Ancient capillaries connecting obscure waypoints on worlds that may not even exist anymore. Their material reality long since consumed by one catastrophe or another. Others are so vast that Eldari fleets can sail through them without touching the walls. Enormous arterial passages that, during the height of the Eldari Empire, functioned as the primary highways of an interstellar civilization that stretched across the galaxy in all directions. These major arteries are so large that, according to certain preserved records, they contained their own internal environments, but with cities built into the walls, with subrealms branching off the main passages that were large enough to contain suns, actual stars, physically relocated from real space, installed within dimensional pockets to provide light and warmth to the port cities built in their glow. Some sections have been measured by the few Mechanicum surveys that have reached them and found to be functionally infinite in extent, long enough that a human being would die of old age travelling through them without ever reaching the other end, if the other end existed at all. And then there is the question of time, which is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Webway that a normal person encounters before things start getting truly strange. The Webway's relationship with time is not like the warp's relationship with time, which is, broadly speaking, as chaotic and unpredictable in the specific ways that a sea full of drowning passengers and hungry predators is chaotic and unpredictable. The Webway's temporal behavior is more structured than that, because the Webway is a structure, but it is structured in ways that do not follow the rules of real space, and in the deeper, older, or more damaged sections, time becomes something with a different character than the linear progression you are probably accustomed to treating as axiomatic. In the intact, well-travelled sections, the routes maintained and used by the craft world Eldari, the passages through which the Dark Eldar conduct their raids, time moves roughly in parallel with real space. Close enough that travellers can plan journeys and arrive at predictable moments, close enough that raiding parties can leave Komorra, execute an assault on an Imperial world, and return before the sector's naval response can reach the target. But in the deeper, older, or more damaged sections, this correspondence begins to break down. Travel in portions of the deep Webway can mean arriving somewhere before you left, or returning to find that what felt like hours was actually decades. The Harlequins speak of specific places within the network where these effects are not incidental but defining, where the very nature of the location is its relationship to time rather than its position in space. There is a place in the Webway where time flows backward. The Harlequins call it Uigebealach. The Eldari have known of its theoretical existence since the height of their empire, and they were afraid of it then. They never experimented with the temporal aspects of the Webway. According to the preserved records, because the potential consequences of getting it wrong in a time-related environment were the kinds of consequences that could retroactively prevent you from ever having made the attempt. Reaching Uigebealach requires a specific route that has never been accurately mapped, one that requires the traveller to exit and re-enter the Webway at precise moments, following logic that contradicts the intuitive understanding of space and direction that navigation usually relies on. Even the greatest Harlequin troop masters were unable to reliably find it. When Inquisitor Jack Draco eventually reached it, it was because he had a navigator's warp eye, as a monocle carved with specific symbols, and because he was using the directions from the Book of Rana Dandra, one of the most closely guarded documents in the Black Library. What happened to Draco in Uigebealach was, to put it gently, transformative in ways that suggest the Eldari's ancestral caution about time-related Webway locations was fully justified. There is also a place in the Webway where time does not flow at all, the crossroads of inertia. What this means practically, whether it is a location of perfect frozen stillness or whether time exists there in some form that simply does not move in any direction, is one of the many aspects of the deep Webway that the lore leaves deliberately and carefully ambiguous. Ambiguous because nobody who has been there has been able to come back and explain it coherently. And ambiguous because the kind of place where time does not flow has by definition no mechanism for producing before and after events of the sort that an explanation requires. Segarach, the laughing god of the Harlequins, is said to be the only being in existence who knows every single path through the Webway, every branching corridor, every sealed dead end, every looping sub-realm, every place where the glass has cracked and the aquarium water has begun to seep through, every location where time behaves incorrectly, every passage that leads to places no longer connected to any map. This knowledge is, by definition, impossibly vast. And the fact that even this divine figure presumably cannot repair most of what has been broken speaks to the scale of the damage accumulated over the course of this structure's history. But knowing a thing and being able to fix it are very different, even for a god. Section 2. The Old Ones and the Dawn of the Labyrinth. To understand the Webway, you must start at the very beginning, with the beings who made it. Because the story of the Webway is inseparable from the story of its creators, and those creators belong to an age so remote that even the most ancient surviving civilizations in the 41st millennium barely remember them as anything more than myth and theory. The Old Ones. The name is a translation of a concept so old that the species who remembered it have themselves mostly vanished, and the records that survive are fragments of fragments. Echoes of stories told by civilizations that were themselves already ancient when the events in question took place. It is what is known about the Old Ones comes primarily from Eldari myth and cosmology, from the dim and terrible memories buried in Necron protocols that were never meant to be examined by outsiders, and from scattered hints encoded in the biology and behavior of races whose existence the Old Ones shaped directly. They were a species of extraordinary antiquity and power, masterful manipulators of both physical science and psychic energy, who established an empire across the galaxy at a time so remote that the sun around which Terra orbits was not yet fully formed, not yet the settled middle-aged star it appears to be in the current era. They were builders of worlds, in the most literal sense. They seeded planets with life according to deliberate design, shaped ecosystems, and evolutionary trajectories to produce specific kinds of organisms for specific purposes, and created or modified entire intelligent species to serve as tools, allies, or experiments. The Eldari themselves are believed to have been created by the Old Ones, engineered into existence as a psychically gifted species whose exceptional sensitivity to the warp made them useful for purposes that remain somewhat unclear in the surviving record. Were they created to maintain the Webway, to serve as inheritors of the Old One's civilization, To fight in a war that was already being anticipated when their creation was authorized? The answers are not fully available, but the pattern is suggestive. The orcs are also believed to have been created by the Old Ones, or rather, redesigned and enhanced from existing life, engineered specifically for war in a biological sense that has no parallel anywhere else in the known galaxy. The Jokaero may be another Old One creation. The Slan, the great frog-like beings that the Eldari of an earlier age called Slan Masters, may be the last direct survivors of the Old Ones themselves, or a subspecies, or a servant race. The records are unclear, and the Slan themselves are not forthcoming. The shape of the Old Ones project, whatever its full scope, was the deliberate population of the galaxy with life according to a design that only they fully understood, using the Webway as the infrastructure that made such galaxy-spanning administration even theoretically possible. The Webway was the Old One's greatest achievement, or at least the one that has lasted longest in its effects. It was created as a solution to the problem that any truly galactic civilization faces. The spaces between stars are not merely large, they are immense, to the point of being effectively impassable at any speed that does not involve shortcuts through other dimensions. The Old One's shortcut was to construct a dimension-spanning tunnel network, threading through the body of the warp without being fully exposed to it, that allowed instantaneous or near-instantaneous travel between any 2 points in the galaxy that were connected by a gate. The technical achievement involved in building the Webway defies casual description. You are talking about a species constructing a physical structure in a dimension that is defined by the absence of fixed physical structure. That's using materials that do not fully exist in either of the 2 dimensions they are bridging, and installing mechanisms in those materials that function as permanent psychic shielding against an environment that has, as one of its fundamental properties, the tendency to destroy anything structured or ordered that comes into contact with it. The Old Ones did not simply build tunnels in the warp. They carved out a piece of the warp and made it into something that was not the warp anymore, a domesticated space, a controlled environment that could coexist with the chaos around it without being consumed by it. How long this took, and how many resources were devoted to it, is not recorded in any surviving source. By the time the Eldari were aware of the Webway's existence, it was already complete in its essential form, a network that spanned the galaxy, connecting worlds from one edge to the other, with major arterial passages large enough for fleets and capillary passages too small for anything larger than a single traveler, with sub-realms and pocket dimensions branching off the main network like the chambers of an enormous and impossibly complex cave system. The Eldari who were taught its secrets received something already built, already old, already ancient in ways that made them look like children, taking possession of a library 10,000 times older than anything in their own history. The war in heaven changed everything about the Webway's security. The Necrontire, a species of short-lived, irradiated beings who had nursed their resentment of the apparently immortal Old Ones for centuries, made an alliance with the Satan, entities of pure stellar fire, who the first Necrontier explorers had inadvertently given physical form by attracting them into constructed shells. The Satan helped the Necrontier transform themselves through a process called the biotransference into the immortal metal beings that would become the Necrons. In exchange for this service, the Necrons dedicated themselves to the Ketan's wars. The war in heaven was the most destructive conflict in the galaxy's history. It lasted millions of years. It ended civilizations, destroyed solar systems, consumed resources, and lives on scales that make every other war in recorded history look like a minor skirmish. And one of its pivotal moments came when the Cetan known as Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, who had, according to certain records, always wanted to bring his fire into the Webway itself, taught the Necrons how to breach the tunnel walls from outside. The device they created was the Dolmen Gate, a portal of living stone that could punch through the Webway's walls and force an entry where none was designed to exist. The Dolmen Gates were inherently unstable and uncontrollable compared to natural entries into the Webway. They were, in engineering terms, a brute force solution, a hammer where a key was needed. And the Webway responded to them in a way that suggests it possesses some form of semi-autonomous defense mechanism, a structural intelligence of sorts, detecting the breach, as attempting to seal off the compromised section from the rest of the network before the contamination could spread. But the Necrons were at war, and they used the dolmen gates continuously, not giving the network time to fully seal compromised sections before new breaches were created. The damage accumulated across millions of years of active combat use, physical breaching of the tunnel walls, contamination from warp energy and Necron technology seeping through the gaps, sections of tunnel exposed to conditions they were never designed to handle for periods of time long enough to permanently compromise their structural integrity. By the time the War in Heaven ended and the Necrons entered their long sleep, the Webway had been damaged in ways that were beyond any single repair operation, ways that could only be addressed piece by piece over millennia and would leave scars that are, in the 41st millennium, still clearly visible in the architecture of the deep tunnels. The old ones were gone. The Webway endured, but it endured carrying the first of what would become a long accumulation of damage that no one has ever been able to fully address. The Eldari, inheriting both the network and the knowledge of how it worked to the extent that knowledge could be transmitted across the civilizational gap between the old ones and their creations, would spend their era trying to maintain what they had received, expand where they could, and navigate around what they could not fix. For a very long time, this worked. The damage from the War in Heaven was extensive, but contained, incorporated into the network's understood geography, or sealed in the sections that could not be safely traversed and routed around by those who knew the alternative paths. Then came the fall, and everything that had been bad became catastrophically worse. Section 3. The Eldari Empire at its height. When the Webway was grand, for long millennia after the War in Heaven ended and the Necrons disappeared into their tombs, the Webway was the greatest piece of infrastructure in the known universe, and the Eldari, who were its primary inheritors, used it with a confidence and ease that would be unimaginable to any being alive today. The craft world Eldari of the 41st millennium travel the Webway's remaining intact passages with the caution of people who know intimately how dangerous a road can be and how easily the familiar route can turn into something unrecognizable. Their ancestors traveled those same routes without looking at their feet. The Eldari Empire, at its height, was not simply a powerful civilization. It was a civilization whose power was expressed through a relationship to space and distance that no other species in the galaxy has ever replicated. Every Eldari world was connected to every other through the Webway. The ports of their cities opened directly into the dimensional passages, so that travel between star systems was not a journey requiring weeks or months of warp transit, and all the existential uncertainty that entails, but something closer to taking a city's transit system to a different district. You entered the Webway, you followed the route you knew, you emerged minutes or hours later in your personal experience, as at your destination tens of thousands of light years away in real space terms. This capacity for movement shaped every aspect of Eldari civilization. Their military forces could deploy with a speed and flexibility that made them effectively unpredictable to any potential enemy. A force of warriors might vanish from one part of the galaxy and appear at a completely different location before any response could be organized, because in the time it would take an enemy fleet to cross the space between where the threat was spotted and where it appeared next, an Eldari force moving through the Webway could cover 1,000 times that distance. Their culture spread and maintained coherence across the galaxy's full extent because people could simply visit each other. Also, you could exchange ideas and artworks and knowledge in person rather than relying on any form of long-range communication. The Webway was not merely transportation infrastructure, it was the connective tissue that made galactic civilization possible as a unified thing rather than a collection of isolated colonies with diverging cultures and eventual mutual incomprehensibility. The port cities were the nodes of this connectivity, and the most impressive of them represent one of the genuine engineering wonders of Eldari history. These were not waypoints in the modern sense, not the Webway gates that Craftworld Eldari construct in the 41st millennium, simple entrance and exit portals that allow movement between specific locations. The old port cities were complete urban environments built inside the Webway itself, those occupying the sub-realms that branched off the major arteries. They had populations, they had architecture, they had culture, some of them had stars. When the Eldari technicians at the height of their empire spoke of installing suns in their Webway sub-realms, they meant this literally. They developed technology for displacing stellar bodies, not large stars. Nothing that would be missed by inhabited solar systems, but small and failing stars. Ancient red dwarfs or brown dwarfs, whose energy output was modest by stellar standards, but enormous by any measure relevant to an urban environment, and relocating them through enormously engineered Webway portals into the dimensional pocket spaces adjacent to the major passages. These stolen suns was called the Ilmea, or Black Suns, in the Drukhari dialect that has preserved the vocabulary for them, provided light and power to the port cities built beneath their glow. Commorragh still uses them, millennia after the fall, and the Drukhari who inhabit the Dark City still look up at the stolen light of stars taken from their real space positions long before any of them were born. Commorragh itself, the greatest of the old port cities, was established in the 18th millennium of the imperial calendar, a span of time so remote that it is genuinely difficult to hold in mind. It was placed at the most central nodal point of the entire Webway network, the location with the greatest number of connected routes, the point where the most major arteries converged, was the hub that was in principle capable of reaching any other location in the network through the smallest number of transits. Because of this centrality, it was also granted a unique political status within the Eldari Empire. No single faction could control it, because control of the network's central node would have been equivalent to control of all interstellar travel, and no faction was trusted with that degree of power. Commorragh was autonomous, outside any council's jurisdiction, a free port in the most literal possible sense, policed only by the competing interests of all who needed it too much to allow it to be destroyed or captured. This autonomy would prove catastrophic in ways that the architects of the arrangement probably did not foresee, or if they foresaw it, did not sufficiently weight against the strategic convenience. What the absence of oversight meant that Commorragh became the natural destination for every Eldari who wished to do things that would not be permitted on policed worlds. The excess cults that would eventually bring down the entire civilization found in Commorragh an ideal home, a place where their behavior was technically no one's problem, where they could establish private sub-realms adjacent to the Webway and conduct whatever they wished in them without interference from any authority. Over the thousands of years leading up to the fall, these sub-realms accumulated in the space around and within the Dark City's complex, each one a self-contained pocket of Eldari decadence that was simultaneously protected by the Webway from outside judgment and feeding the growing thing in the warp that would eventually consume them all. What the Eldari at the height of their empire knew the Webway was a structure with anomalies. They had mapped the damage from the War in Heaven, sealed the most dangerous compromised sections, and incorporated the others into their understanding of routes that required extra care. They had theoretical literature suggesting that the Webway's relationship with time was stranger than its practical use revealed, that the complete structure, if it could ever be mapped, might show connections not just across space but across time, routes that existed in multiple temporal positions simultaneously. But they did not explore these theoretical aspects. The practical aspects of the Webway were so richly sufficient for all the civilization's transit needs that venturing into the unexplained corners seemed not just unnecessary, but potentially reckless. They were building an empire, not conducting a research expedition. Then the empire began to destroy itself, slowly, and then all at once. Section 4. The Fall. The night the Webway broke the fall of the Eldari. This is the event that defines everything that follows in this story, the catastrophe against which every other catastrophe in Eldari history is measured and found comparatively minor. The birth of a chaos god, the destruction of a galactic civilization, the creation of the Eye of Terror, the near extinction of what had been the dominant intelligent species in the galaxy for millions of years. All of this emerging from the cumulative weight of billions of beings making choices about their personal lives, which is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of it. Not an external enemy, not a cosmic accident. A self-inflicted wound so thorough that it reshaped the galaxy permanently. The Aeldari were psychically powerful beings in ways that made their emotional lives profoundly different from those of most other species. Every sensation they experienced resonated in the warp with an intensity that a human's equivalent experience could not approach. Where a human feeling joy sends a small ripple through the Imperium, an Aeldari feeling joy sends something considerably larger. And when the content of those feelings shifts, when the dominant emotional output of a species of billions begins to trend toward the darker end of the spectrum, toward experiences pursued with an intensity and a self-abandonment that normal moral frameworks would hesitate to describe in detail, the warp responds to the scale of that change proportionally. The thing that grew in the warp in response to the Eldari's spiritual collapse was not born overnight. It accumulated over thousands of years, drawing sustenance from every extreme sensation, every act of cruelty elevated to art, every pleasure pursued past any boundary, until the boundary itself was the point. In the warp, these psychic outputs coalesced the way that any strong and sustained emotional resonance coalesces in the Imperium. They took on a life of their own, became a nascent consciousness, grew and grew and grew, until the thing it was becoming began to exert its own gravitational pull on the emotions of those around it. The Aeldari, who sensed this happening, and some did, the Farseers, of what would become the Craftworld Eldari, had been raising warnings for centuries before the end, fled. They built the Craftworlds, vast cities in space constructed with wastelands and infinity circuits and every other psychic technology they had at their disposal to insulate them from the growing presence. They launched these arcs into the void and traveled as far as they could from the center of the civilization, refusing to look back at what was accumulating. The Exodites went further, to distant worlds at the galaxy's edges, cutting their cultural connections as thoroughly as geography permitted. The majority did not leave, could not leave, by that point, or would not. The civilization had progressed far enough into its own excess that the ordinary mechanisms of alarm and response had been overwhelmed. What remained was momentum, the terrible self-reinforcing quality of a trajectory that has been so thoroughly established that even the beings on it can no longer imagine an alternative. The end came all at once. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, she who thirsts, the name the Aeldari will not speak, tore into existence through the collected soul of the civilization, birthing itself by consuming the psychic energy of billions of Eldari in a single catastrophic moment. In real space, this expressed as the Eye of Terror, a permanent warp rift covering an enormous swath of the galaxy, swallowing hundreds of Eldari worlds and everything on them. In the warp, it was a new god announcing itself, reshaping the landscape of the Imperium around its newborn hunger. And in the Webway, it was expressed as something more personal and more comprehensive than either of those other events. The psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth hit the Webway from the inside. The Webway sits in the space between real space and the warp. And that birth scream, not literally a sound, but a force of psychic energy that makes the concept of a sound seem inadequate, transmitted through the warp-facing surface of the Webway's structure with devastating effect. Thousands of tunnel segments lost their psychic shielding simultaneously. The walls cracked, the glass shattered, and the warp poured in through the gaps, with the enthusiasm of something that has been pressing against a barrier for a very long time and has just felt it give way. Through those gaps came everything the warp had been patiently accumulating outside. It was demons in numbers that defied counting, drawn by the psychic scent of Eldari souls that had suddenly become exposed after millennia of protection. The new god's own emanations, hungry and immediate, and specifically designed by nature to consume the very beings whose excess had called it into existence. Things that had been circling the outer edges of the Webway since the war in heaven, entities that had detected the network's weakened sections during that earlier conflict and had simply been waiting with the geological patience that sufficiently alien entities can exhibit for an opening large enough to be useful. The port cities that survived were the ones whose occupants had the presence of mind and the pre-existing defenses to seal themselves in before the wave of destruction reached them. Abyss Comora survived because its inhabitants had spent centuries developing exactly those defensive capabilities. Private subrealms with independent sealing, runic wards around every significant node, the knowledge and the technology to shut themselves away from the rest of the network before the rest of the network became catastrophically unsafe. They sealed themselves in and endured. What they sealed themselves in with, the thing that their excessive behavior had been feeding in the warp, the god who now pressed against every Drukhari soul with an appetite specifically tailored to Aeldari's psychic energy, was, in a very personal and permanent way, themselves. The craft world Aeldari, who survived, were cut off from each other in ways that took years to resolve. Sure, the Webway routes they had relied on for their entire civilization's connectivity were mostly gone, or compromised in ways that made them more dangerous than warp transit. Navigating to each other meant threading through a labyrinth that had just been catastrophically rearranged, in which sealed doors might now be the only barrier between a safe passage and something that had been hunting for exactly this opportunity to encounter a living Aeldari soul. The Harlequins vanished into the Webway. After the fall, the worshippers of Kegarash simply disappeared from everywhere else, leaving the craft worlds, the Exodite worlds, every location where they had been present, and entered the labyrinth. They would not be seen clearly again for millennia, and when they reappeared, they had been shaped by their time in the Webway into something more focused and more terrible than their pre-fall ancestors, carrying in their performance art and their combat doctrine the full weight of what they had learned in the labyrinth during that long silence. The post-fall Aeldari began the work of mapping the disaster and containing what could be contained. This was not restoration, and they did not pretend it was. Restoration would have required resources and knowledge they no longer had access to. The great engineering archives were gone. The master craftsmen who maintained the old port cities were dead or unreachable, and the specific techniques for rebuilding the tunnel walls' psychic shielding were not available in the fragments of knowledge that survived. What was available was the knowledge of where the damage was, and the runic technology to seal individual sections, and a grim pragmatism that came from understanding that every Aeldari life sacrificed in an attempt to clear a compromised section was an Aeldari life that could never be replaced. So the doors went up. One by one, all across the galaxy's span of the Webway, the surviving Aeldari sealed the damaged sections with the best wards they had available and moved on to the next compromise. They accepted that the Webway they had now was smaller, more fragmented, more dangerous than the one their ancestors had used, and that the correct response to this reality was not mourning, but adaptation. The routes they could not safely travel were abandoned. The sections they could not safely seal were sealed imperfectly and surrounded by additional warnings. And the things they sealed inside those sections were left to whatever darkness had accumulated in them since the glass shattered and the warp came flooding in. Section 5, the Necron Scar. Ancient wounds and dolmen gates. Some of the sealed sections in the deep Webway have been sealed for 60 million years. This number is large enough that it can feel abstract. 60 million years ago, the most complex organism on Earth was a small mammal that had not yet developed the capacity to feel existentially troubled by a figure like 60 million years. In the context of the Webway, 60 million years of warp contamination, 60 million years of whatever fills a dimension once its protection fails. 60 million years of accumulation in a space that was never designed to be left alone. It produces something that is genuinely beyond the categories available in any current bestiaries or threat assessments. The Necron damage to the Webway began during the War in Heaven and was never fully repaired. The dolmen gates punched through the tunnel walls in locations across the galaxy, creating unauthorized breach points that the Webway's self-healing mechanisms struggled to address. sealing one section only for a new dolmen gate to be activated nearby, creating a situation where the Webway was effectively fighting a slow-motion war.
Look, I just want to pause here and just be honest with you for a second, because we talk about the Webway all the time in the context of who uses it and what it connects, but I think the sheer scale of what is lost in it almost never gets the attention it deserves. We talk about the fall, we talk about the Eye of Terror, and those are the big headline events. But the Webway is where the whole shape of what the Eldari civilization used to be most visible. Every sealed door is a number, every ruined corridor is a metric, and when you add them up, what you get is a picture of a galaxy that used to have a spine, this enormous functioning galaxy spanning infrastructure, and now it is held together with the functional equivalent of tape and willpower, and the stubborn refusal of a dying species to let go of the last thing keeping them connected to each other. And I find that genuinely moving. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Against the very beings using it as a transit route, the gates were inherently unstable, detected by the network, and rejected in a way that resembled an immune response. But the Necrons were persistent and numerous, and did not particularly care about the health of a structure they were using as a weapon against its own builders. The damage patterns visible in the deep Webway from this period have a characteristic signature that differs from the full damage in several ways. Full damage tends to be extensive but somewhat uniform. The psychic shockwave hit broadly and damaged broadly, producing compromised sections distributed throughout the network, but with a relatively consistent character. Necron damage from the dolmen gates is localized and deep, specific breach points surrounded by zones of increasingly severe contamination, like infection sites around wounds. Some of these sites have been sealed by the Eldari over the millennia, but the sealing often incorporates rather than addresses the underlying damage. The breach is contained, not repaired, and what was in the section when the seal went up has been in there since. In the current era, the Necrons still maintain and use whatever functional dolmen gates remain from the War in Heaven period, plus whatever new ones they have constructed since their awakening from the Great Sleep. The Eldari destroy them when they find them, but finding them is not always immediate. A newly activated dolmen gate can create a breach and be used for significant time before the Webway's detection mechanisms register it fully and before Eldari patrols become aware of the intrusion. During that window, the contamination progresses, the tunnel walls weaken further in the affected section, and the contents of whatever was behind the walls seeps through. The Eldari response when a dolmen gate incursion is detected is swift and surgical. They do not attempt to fight their way through the affected section and destroy the gate from inside. They seal the section immediately, sacrificing the route permanently, rather than attempting a clearance operation that would put Eldari lives at risk in compromised tunnel for uncertain gain. This is the post-fall calculus in action. The Webway they have is what they have, and adding more compromised sections to it is far less acceptable than accepting the loss of routes that were compromised from outside. Every dolmen gate activation that is sealed is a small permanent subtraction from the network's usable extent. The Necrons, who have been active in the galaxy in increasing numbers since their mass awakening, have been making these subtractions at a pace that the Eldari track with the grim attention of accountants managing a steadily declining balance. There is also the question of what the old, closed dolmen gate sections have become in 60 million years of isolation. The short answer is that no one knows with any confidence, because the investigation required to answer the question would involve opening the seals. And the consensus across every faction that might conceivably want to do this is that the benefit of knowing cannot justify the risk of what might emerge. The longer answer is that whatever was contaminating those sections when they were sealed, Necron technology, warp energy, as the entities that moved through the dolmen gate itself, has had 60 million years to reach whatever equilibrium conditions are achievable in damaged Webway space. The entities that formed in the immediate aftermath of the breaches may have grown, adapted, diversified into forms that do not exist anywhere else in the known galaxy, or they may have simply stabilized into powerful demonic presences with long-established territorial behaviors and the patience that comes from having no particular reason to be anywhere else. Either prospect is concerning in different ways. Section 6. The Emperor's Gambit, the great work that failed. It is time to speak of the most significant human interaction with the Webway, and the one that continues to shape the Imperium's entire political and spiritual situation 10,000 years after the fact. Whilst the Emperor's Webway project, the great work, was the most ambitious undertaking in human history, a plan that would have changed the fundamental character of humanity's relationship to the stars if it had been completed, and whose failure has imprisoned the most powerful being humanity has ever produced in a chair from which he cannot move, for 10,000 years and counting, with no end in sight. The Emperor of mankind, in the late 30th millennium, discovered something buried beneath Terra's surface that nobody else knew was there. Under a vast and inhospitable desert on the Asian continent, his surveys found an access portal to the Webway, a naturally occurring gate into the Old One network, dormant for tens of millions of years, waiting beneath the Earth's surface since the last time the Old Ones had used it. Was the Webway gate was real, was functional in principle, and was connected to the broader labyrinthine dimension in ways that the Emperor, with his extraordinary intelligence and his millennia of accumulated knowledge, could analyze sufficiently to understand what it meant strategically. What it meant was a solution to humanity's most fundamental problem. The warp was the only practical medium for faster-than-light travel, but the warp was also the realm of chaos, the home of the things trying to destroy humanity, the medium through which the ruinous powers exercise their influence over the material universe. Every warp transit was a vulnerability. Every navigator and astropath was a vulnerability. Every psyker born in the Imperium was a vulnerability, because each one was a source of warp energy that the forces of chaos could theoretically locate and exploit. The entire Imperium was built on a foundation of perpetual exposure to the very force trying to bring it down. The Webway bypassed all of this. Travel through the intact passages of the Webway involved no warp exposure, required no psykers to navigate, left no psychic footprint that demons could track or chaos gods could follow. An Imperium that travelled through the Webway rather than the warp would be an Imperium that had decisively separated itself from its greatest vulnerability. The chaos gods would be deprived of their primary vectors of influence. The slow decay of the Imperium through warp-related corruption and the psychological toll of warp transit would stop. Was the tens of thousands of psykers burned as fuel for the Golden Throne's Astronomicon beacon, a sacrifice that happens every day in the current era, would become unnecessary. The Emperor designed the project in secret, calling it the great work to prevent anyone from understanding what he was actually doing. The Golden Throne, which most of his subjects believed was an archaeotech life support device of some kind, was actually the nexus of his Webway project. A device of almost incomprehensible complexity that would, when properly operated, hold open humanity's connection to the Webway and maintain the psychic shielding that protected the new human-built tunnel extensions from warp intrusion. He created a new caste of Mechanicum workers, the Unifiers, to construct the new passages that would connect Terra's portal to the existing Eldari Webway network. He kept everything classified at levels of secrecy that went beyond anything else in the Great Crusade. The most important project in human history was known in its full nature to almost nobody. The critical vulnerability in the design was that the new human-built tunnel extensions could not self-maintain. The Old One and Eldari tunnel construction used materials that generated their own psychic shielding, an innate property of the construction technique that the Emperor could study but not fully replicate given the technology available. The human-built extensions required the Emperor's own psychic will, sustained through the Golden Throne, to maintain their shielding from moment to moment. If he ever stopped, if his attention was diverted or his concentration broken, the new tunnels would lose their protection and the warp would immediately flood in through the resulting gaps. This dependency was calculated and accepted. The Emperor believed, with the confidence of a being who had been the most powerful psychic entity in human history for longer than most of humanity's greatest empires had existed, that he could maintain the required concentration. His plan was presumably to progress the project far enough before any emergency arose that the human-built sections could be reinforced through other means. Stabilized by Eldari cooperation, perhaps, or maintained by a relay of powerful psychers using techniques being developed specifically for this purpose. But the plan required time that events refused to provide. So Magnus the Red saw the treachery that Horus and others were planning. He understood the scale of the coming catastrophe, the Horus heresy, the greatest civil war in human history, which would consume the Imperium and change it permanently. He tried to warn the Emperor through official channels and was blocked. He tried through intermediaries and was circumvented. Finally, in desperation, he employed the one method he knew would definitely get through, a direct psychic sending of enough power to simply overwhelm any barrier in its path. The sending worked. The Emperor received the message, and the wards that protected the great work were shredded in the process, because Magnus's sending tore through every psychic shield it encountered, including the ones that were keeping humanity's new Webway tunnels from immediate collapse. As the gateway opened, the warp poured in. Demons flooded through the breach in numbers, and with a speed that no conventional defensive response could address. The Emperor abandoned the Golden Throne in its operational purpose, advancing the great work, and used it instead as a plug, a seal, the only device powerful enough to hold the gateway shut against the pressure of what was trying to come through. He has been sitting there for 10,000 years. The great work is over. The new tunnels are gone. The dream of a Webway for humanity is dead, and its death has guaranteed that humanity will remain dependent on the warp for travel and communication, will remain exposed to all the vulnerability that comes with that dependency, which will continue burning tens of thousands of psychers every day just to maintain the navigation beacon that makes the Imperium function. And beneath the Imperial Palace, behind the Golden Throne, the gateway still exists, still intact, still full of what came through during Magnus's folly and the subsequent war in the Webway, still waiting for any moment of weakness from the figure who holds it shut. This is the door that the custodians guard most closely, not to keep outsiders from going in, but to make certain that nothing on the inside gets out. Section 7. The Secret War. 5 years in the Webway. The war in the Webway is not mentioned in most imperial histories. It is not taught in the Schola Progenium. It does not appear in the public records of the Horus heresy. Almost no one outside the custodians, the Silent Sisterhood, and the very highest levels of certain inquisitorial orders knows it happened. And in some ways, this is the most remarkable thing about it. Not the war itself, which is extraordinary enough, but the capacity to conduct a years-long apocalyptic battle in a dimension adjacent to the capital world of the greatest human civilization in history, and then successfully suppress any record of it afterward. When the gateway beneath the Imperial Palace breached after Magnus's folly, the Emperor dispatched into the Webway the two most elite forces under his command, the Legio Custodes, his personal bodyguard, beings created through enhancement processes that made Space Marines look like the rough drafts they somewhat were, warriors of such capability that even other warriors of extraordinary distinction found them unsettling to stand next to, and the Sisters of Silence, the Null Maidens, whose psychic nullity made them among the most effective weapons against demonic entities in any environment where that nullity could be brought to bear. These forces entered the human-built sections of the Webway and found themselves in something that defied the categories available to them. They were not in the warp. The tunnel structure still existed and provided some degree of dimensional coherence. But they were not in fully stable space either. The breach sections were saturated with warp energy. The tunnel walls flickered between solid and translucent, and the entities moving through the space were not behaving the way demons behaved in either a real space manifestation or a direct warp encounter. They were stable in ways that suggested a more permanent habitation than the usual demonic manifestation, and they were aggressive in ways that suggested either intelligence about the defensive position of the Imperial forces, or a territorial confidence born of already considering the tunnels their domain. The custodians and sisters established a series of blockades across the tunnels. Behind these defended positions, The Mechanicum workers repaired damaged sections and sealed warp rifts as quickly as their considerable skills permitted. In front of the blockades, the elite warriors launched lightning-fast counterattacks to prevent the demonic hordes from consolidating and pressing in force against the defensive lines. The pattern that developed, attack, defend, repair, hold, settled into an attritional war that the Imperial forces were slowly, grimly advancing in. But the Chaos powers were watching this too, and they escalated. The first stage of the opposition was demons. The second stage was demons and corrupted Chaos Space Marines. The third stage brought Titans, war machines the size of buildings, piloted by traitor legions, striding through the Webway's tunnels like someone had decided that apocalyptic artillery should have legs. Greater demons appeared, beings of immense power who were used to constituting the worst threat on any given battlefield and who found the confined geometry of the Webway passages a tactical problem they were willing to solve with the absolute maximum of force at their disposal. The battle eventually centered on Kalistar, the impossible city, an abandoned Eldari port that had been incorporated into the human Webway construction, an ancient and architecturally magnificent urban space that became, in the context of a war nobody would ever write about, one of the most intensely fought urban battlefields in human history. The Custodians used its ancient Eldari architecture as fortification, its spires as sniper positions, its plazas as killing grounds. They held it against escalating assault for years. When Kalistar fell, it fell through a combination of external assault and internal treachery, Mechanicum forces who broke from the Alliance for their own reasons, and the arrival of a demon that had possessed a Mechanicum construct large enough to qualify as a weapon of war in its own right. When the surviving Custodians and Sisters were driven back all the way to the gateway, fighting with the desperation of beings who understood that if they were pushed back through the threshold into the Imperial Palace itself, terror was lost. What the Emperor did then is one of the rare moments in the lore where the scale of his power is presented without qualification or softening. He left the Golden Throne, knowing that doing so risked the gateway collapsing, after having 1,000 Psykers sacrificed to maintain it in his absence for one day. He went into the Webway, and he fought. The lore describes him as appearing as a burning golden figure, the absolute distillation of humanity's psychic potential focused into a single act of combat, summoning the blazing echoes of his loyal dead to fight beside him, whilst driving the demonic host back through the passages they had taken, with a force that had no natural equivalent in any catalogue of weapons. He bound Drachnion, the demon who called itself the embodiment of his ending. He drove back the Chaos armies to a point where the threat to terror was eliminated. Then he walked back to the Golden Throne and sat down, and his attention has been entirely occupied by that single act of sustained psychic endurance ever since. The Custodians who survived, a fraction of the 10,000, the rest having given their lives in the tunnels, formed the permanent garrison of a gateway that cannot be opened and cannot be abandoned. The Webway sections that formed this battlefield are not available for exploration. What they contain now is, after 10,000 years of warp saturation and the psychic residue of a battle fought by the most powerful beings in the galaxy against the most powerful expressions of chaos, is not something that can be approached without consequence. These sections are among the most thoroughly sealed in the entire network. The runes on their doors are among the most densely packed and carefully maintained, and what lives behind them has had 10,000 years of undisturbed accumulation in a space that has never been cleared or checked. Section 8. What lives in the deep? Inhabitants of the forgotten passages. The deep Webway is not empty. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about why nobody explores it, and it is easy to lose track of because the sheer scale of what we are talking about. A network spanning the galaxy, most of it damaged and sealed and inaccessible, suggests emptiness by the logic of abandoned spaces. But the Webway's damaged sections are not empty in the way that an abandoned building is empty. They are occupied. They have been occupied since the moment the damage first created the conditions for occupation, and they have been accumulating residents ever since. The most straightforward of the deep Webway's inhabitants are the demons. This needs a moment of care, because calling them straightforward risks understatement in ways that the situation does not deserve. These are not the freshly manifested entities of a real space summoning ritual, beings that appear in the physical world, already fighting against the grain of a reality that is not their native environment. Too vulnerable to psychic wards and blessed ammunition, and the concentrated will of souls who understand what they are. The demons that have inhabited the deep webway for thousands or tens of thousands of years, in some sections for millions of years, have adapted to the specific environmental conditions of that liminal space. The webway's damaged sections represent an unusual environment. The warp is present in sufficient quantity to sustain demonic existence, but the dimensional structure of the tunnel provides a more defined physical geometry than the warp itself offers. Demons in the warp are essentially energy patterns in a fluid medium, persistent and powerful, but subject to the currents and disruptions of that medium, reshaped by the constant changes in psychic weather that characterize the Imperium. Our demons in the damaged webway have something closer to a consistent location. They have territory, they have topology to learn and exploit, and they have been, in their particular section of tunnel, long enough to have become genuinely expert in its geography. An old demon, one that has been present in the same section of deep webway for 10,000 years, knows that section in ways that an exploring force simply cannot. It knows where the walls are weakest and can exploit them. It knows which passages lead to dead ends and can maneuver enemies into them. It knows the temporal anomalies in its territory and has developed behaviors around them, ways of using the webway's strange relationship with time as tactical terrain in the same way a human general uses elevation or choke points. It has had 10,000 years to develop, but to become something more than the entity it was when it first found itself in this space. And that development has not been happening in a direction that makes it easier to deal with. The Psych-Nuin deserve separate treatment because they are something other than demonic and operate according to a different logic. These creatures are the webway's most distinctive endemic hazards. Wasp-like beings roughly 2.5 meters in length, psychic predators that target specifically the mentally gifted. Their method is elegant in the way that biological weapons are elegant, which is to say deeply unpleasant to experience on the receiving end. They locate psychers, implant larvae within them, and the larvae develop inside the living host, by consuming them from the inside, while the infection progressively disrupts the victim's mental functioning in ways that make them difficult or impossible to help, even if their companions recognize what is happening. There is a theory among certain Eldari scholars that the Psych-Nuin are native to the webway itself, rather than to the warp, that they evolved specifically in the liminal space of the passages, adapted over millions of years to the particular characteristics of that environment. They have been found in real space in association with worlds that have webway connections, and specifically on worlds associated with the old ones, which suggests an origin that predates the Eldari's use of the network. If they are genuinely native rather than warp-derived, this makes them something qualitatively different from demons. Not invaders that have pushed through from the warp, but genuine inhabitants of the space, as native to it as anything can be native to a constructed hyperdimensional structure. The weakening of webway walls in the most damaged sections has allowed the Psych-Nuin to spread through the network in ways that were not possible when the tunnel integrity was higher. Entire regions have been sealed by the Eldari specifically because the Psych-Nuin infestation density had reached the point where traversal would be suicidal even for heavily armed groups, and where clearing the infestation would require resources that could not be justified against the limited strategic benefit of regaining access to compromised passages. The seals on these sections carry a specific quality of warning that Eldari psychic symbology uses for the category of threat that has no safe response. Not a caution, but a statement that this section contains something with which no productive interaction is possible. Beyond the named creatures, there are things in the deep webway for which no taxonomy exists. The accumulated effect of tens of millions of years of warp contamination in spaces designed by the most advanced civilization the galaxy has produced, the residue of battles fought by beings of incalculable power, the psychic echoes of civilizations that were destroyed while still inside the tunnels. These things have had time to become whatever they were going to become. Some sections of the deep webway have been sealed since before the Eldari Empire existed. What has been developing in them for 60 million years, in a space that touches the warp but is not quite the warp, shaped by conditions that have no parallel anywhere else in the known galaxy, is genuinely unknown. The Harlequins, whose knowledge of the webway is the most comprehensive of any surviving beings, have names for some of these entities. Many of those names are not used in conversation, even among themselves. They are invocations of specific ritual status, used only in the context of specific procedures for dealing with encounters, and are not shared outside those contexts. The temporal anomalies of the deep webway are not strictly inhabitants, but they function as hazards with something approaching intentionality in terms of their effects on travelers. As places where time runs backward create the possibility of encountering the future before experiencing it, which sounds advantageous until you consider what that actually means in a hostile environment, finding yourself in possession of memories of events that have not yet occurred, unable to distinguish those memories from the ordinary ones, navigating by a map that is partly constructed from what has already happened and partly from what is going to happen, with no reliable way to tell which parts are which. The crossroads of inertia, where time does not flow, presents a different kind of problem. Entering a space where time is absent may mean experiencing a version of consciousness that has no duration, no sequence, no before and after. Whether a being that enters such a space ever leaves it in any meaningful sense, or whether they simply cease to exist as a temporally extended entity, is a question the law does not answer because it cannot. Section 9. The sealed doors and what lies behind them. Every sealed door in the webway is a story that ends with the same conclusion. Someone or something encountered something in a section of the deep webway that was too dangerous or too strange or too thoroughly alien to address through any available means. And the response was to seal that section off from the rest of the network, mark the seal with warnings in psychic language that would be legible to any Eldari who encountered it, and accept that what was behind the door would remain behind the door permanently. This is not described in the law as a failure. It is described as maintenance. The sealed sections form a significant portion of the webway's total extent, more than most people who think of the webway as primarily a transit network appreciate. The routes used by the craft-world Eldari, the Dark Eldar, and the occasional non-Eldari traveler with enough knowledge to navigate the labyrinth. These are the surviving intact fraction of a structure that was, at its greatest extent, orders of magnitude larger. The sealed sections vastly outnumber the passable ones. The deep webway is not simply the dangerous part of a mostly functional network. It is the majority of the network, with the dangerous parts sealed off. What appears on any functional map of the webway is a small residual fraction of what was there before the fall. Some sealed sections contain documented warp breaches, places where the tunnel wall has failed completely enough that the passage interior is effectively continuous with the warp for some portion of its length. These are sealed because they represent the same type of hazard as an open airlock. The seal keeps the contamination from spreading to adjacent sections, and removing the seal would allow whatever is in the compromised section access to the intact network in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. The entities currently in a section like this are there because they came through the breach. Removing the seal does not remove the breach. It just removes the barrier between the breach and everything else. Some sealed sections contain established demonic habitations, territory that functions, for all practical purposes, what is a small demon world embedded in the dimensional structure of the tunnel. These are known to exist because the Eldari who performed the sealing observed them long enough to characterize what they contained before sealing them. The entities in these sections are not merely present in the damaged tunnel. They have, over however many centuries or millennia they have occupied the space, organized the damaged tunnel into something that functions according to their nature, reshaped the spatial and psychic properties of the damaged section into an environment suited to their existence. Clearing such a section would require an assault into what is functionally an enemy stronghold, in an environment where the enemy has complete home advantage, conducted at a distance from any resupply or reinforcement. Or with no clear exit strategy, and no tolerable casualty rate for beings whose species numbers in the millions. Some sealed sections are suspected, with varying degrees of confidence, to contain survivable conditions, passages that are damaged but not catastrophically so, or that were sealed not because of acute danger but because of uncertainty about what they contained, and a judgment that the risk of investigation exceeded the potential benefit. These are not, practically speaking, much safer to explore than the others. A section sealed because its contents were uncertain is a section whose contents have continued developing in the absence of any investigation since the seal went up, which may have been thousands of years ago. What the Eldari were uncertain about then has had that time to become whatever it was going to become. Entering such a section is not equivalent to entering a stable room that has simply been locked. It is entering a space that has been undergoing changes, possibly significant changes, in conditions designed to produce exactly the sorts of entities and situations that sealed door warnings are meant to discourage approaching. The Black Library holds the most complete information about the sealed sections that exists in any accessible source. The maps and records kept there include the findings of every Harlequin expedition that has ventured into the deep Webway, the theoretical analyses of the Eldari scholars whose work has been preserved since before the fall, and the observations of the solitaires, who are the most deeply experienced navigators of the labyrinth. Inquisitor Chevak, who had access to the library and to portions of what it contained about the Webway, was notably reticent about the specifics of what he learned. His surviving writings on the deep Webway discuss its dangers in general terms and its history with considerable precision, but become carefully vague when it comes to the question of what specific sealed sections contain, and explicitly non-committal when it comes to the question of whether any of them should ever be opened. There are also sections, referenced in the most oblique terms in the deepest Harlequin traditions, that were sealed not because of what had gotten in, but because of what had always been there. Old One sections, built for purposes that go beyond what the Eldari reconstruction of those purposes can account for. What these passages follow roots and internal logic that makes sense only within a framework of understanding that no currently living species possesses. They connect points that have no obvious relationship to any existing or historical inhabited location. They may be interfaces with the Webway's theoretical temporal dimensions, connections to the network's potential deeper structure, the parts that theoretically stretch backward and forward through time, rather than merely sideways through space. They may serve functions in the overall structure that are not transit-related at all. Maintenance systems, or monitoring systems, or something for which no existing vocabulary has an appropriate word. These Old One sections were never sealed by the Eldari because of their contents. They were sealed by the Eldari because nobody knew how to use them safely, and nobody trusted any investigation of them to end in a way that was manageable. The Old Ones built the Webway for a civilization that no longer exists, using principles that no living being can fully reconstruct. What the Webway's deep structure is actually doing, what the Old One built sections at the heart of the network are actually for, is genuinely unknown. And the Eldari, who have been living with the remnants of the Old Ones as civilization for 60 million years, have learned to treat what they cannot understand with a caution that approaches reverence. Section 10. Those who were lost. The deep Webway has taken people, not merely travelers who lost their way and wandered until the darkness and the hunger and the things in the dark took them, though there have been those as well in uncountable numbers. It has taken specific, significant, powerful individuals, people whose disappearance into the labyrinth left a mark on the history of the galaxy precisely because they were capable enough and prepared enough that simply getting lost should not have been possible. And yet the Webway consumed them regardless. Jaghatai Khan, the Great Khan, Primarch of the White Scars Space Marine Legion, one of the Emperor's genetically engineered sons, a warrior whose physical capabilities and tactical genius made him among the most dangerous individuals in the history of the Imperium. The White Scars hold, as a matter of faith as much as assessment, that the Great Khan still lives somewhere in the Webway. Was the circumstances of his disappearance involve a pursuit of dark Eldar forces into the labyrinth's passages, following the trail of enemies who had been conducting raids on his people with the ease that access to the Webway makes possible, until the Dark Eldar led him deep enough that finding the way back out became a problem that 10,000 years have not yet resolved. What this means practically is something the White Scars have had a great deal of time to avoid examining too closely. A Primarch's capabilities far exceed those of an ordinary Space Marine, far exceed those of most things the deep Webway contains in its usual inventory of horrors. But a Primarch who has been inside the deep Webway for 10,000 years has been in there for 10,000 years, in an environment where time does not always behave consistently, but in passages where things have been accumulating for much longer than that, without resupply or reinforcement or any possibility of contact with the civilization he served. Whether such a figure is best described as still alive in any meaningful sense, or as having experienced something for which the alive-dead distinction is less the relevant axis than some other axis that we do not have a good word for, is a question the lore leaves carefully unresolved. The Dark Eldar who live within the Webway and use its passages routinely have their own lost. The deep city of Komorrach is bordered on all sides by regions of the network that even its own residents do not enter casually, as sections that were once part of the Dark City's sphere of influence, and that were sealed as Komorrach expanded through conquest and absorption of neighbouring subrealms. Some of these sections were sealed because they became dangerous. Warp breaches, infestations, the aftermath of the battles by which Komorrach expanded in the first place. Some were sealed for reasons that have been lost to the political amnesia that the Dark City cultivates, its leaders understanding that history is a liability when your power depends on controlling the narrative. The Inquisition has lost agents. This is not surprising. The Inquisition sends agents into most things that threaten or might threaten the Imperium, and the Webway qualifies by any measure. What is more notable is that some of these losses have occurred in expeditions that were considered successful enough in planning and preparation to justify the risk. Expeditions staffed by individuals whose track records of surviving extreme situations made their loss a genuine surprise, rather than an expected casualty. The deep Webway does not respect track records of survival. The skills that have kept an individual alive through decades of confronting chaos and Xenos threats in real space do not transfer seamlessly to an environment where the laws of physics are optional, and where the opposition has been living in its specific territory since before the age of the dinosaurs. What these losses collectively communicate is something important about the nature of the threat. Whilst the deep Webway is not hostile in the way that a battlefield is hostile, a defined space with defined enemies with accessible capabilities, where preparation and tactical competence provide genuine protection. It is hostile in the way that an extreme natural environment is hostile, through a range of hazards that are not trying to kill you, because killing you is not their purpose, but whose existence is simply incompatible with yours. The temporal anomalies are not traps. The demons that have inhabited particular sections for millions of years are not hunting you specifically. The structural failures that drop passages out of existence into warp space are not being engineered by a malicious intelligence. The hostile character of the deep Webway emerges from the aggregate incompatibility between what it is and what you need in order to survive. And that is a harder thing to address than any organized opposition. Even the most powerful beings in the galaxy have found this out. Even someone who can walk into the warp itself and survive, as the Emperor did when he descended into the Webway during the war, is operating in an environment where the rules that govern their power have changed in ways that may not be fully apparent until those changes have become relevant in a lethal way. The Webway is very old. It has seen many things. And what it has become in the sections where it has been alone with the dark for millions of years is something that does not have a category in any bestiary or threat assessment written by beings who have only seen the intact parts. Section 11, the present age, a broken road getting worse. The 41st Millennium, and the period immediately following it in the current lore, represents the Webway at perhaps its worst state since the fall itself. Multiple compounding crises have hit the network in a compressed span of time that, by the standards of the structure's history, is almost instantaneous. The damage is not just accumulating, but accelerating, and the capacity to address new damage while managing the existing extent of old damage is strained in ways that the Eldari, whatever their disagreements on other matters, universally recognize as serious. The formation of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the galaxy-spanning warp rift that tore through the material universe in the years surrounding the fall of Cadia, sent shockwaves through every dimension connected to the warp. The Webway, sitting in the space between real space and the Imperium, was hit in a way that real space itself was not. The shockwaves opened closed gates into real space in locations across the galaxy, reactivated closed sub-realms by blowing their seals, collapsed stable sections that had been intact since before the fall, and transformed some already compromised sections into screaming rents that emptied directly into the Imperium, rather than simply connecting imperfectly to it. The Harlequins characterized the period following the Great Rift's formation as one of the most severe crises the network has faced since the event that created the Eye of Terror. Their numbers have been growing, the lore notes. More Eldari are answering Sigarak's summons and disappearing into the Webway than at any point in recent memory. This is not straightforwardly reassuring. It could indicate that the Laughing God is gathering forces for some response to the crisis. It could indicate that entering the Webway is paradoxically safer than remaining in the increasingly dangerous real space that surrounds the network's entry points. It could indicate a great many things, and none of the most obvious interpretations lead somewhere simple or comfortable. Commorragh has been shaken in ways that its inhabitants, yet who have absorbed the aftermath of wars, invasions, and political upheavals that would have ended any less ruthlessly pragmatic civilization, found genuinely alarming. The disjunction, the catastrophic spiritual event triggered within the Dark City's bounds, opened Cain's Gate, a sealed section of the Webway that the Drukhari themselves had sealed because its contents were something they specifically did not want loose. What came through was demonic in character and quantity, enough so that even the supreme ruler of Commorragh, a being who has survived everything the past 10,000 years could throw at him, found himself retreating from his own city's districts and plunging them into subdimensional spaces to contain the spread of the infestation. The city is partially sundered, some districts are permanently lost, and some of the sub-realms that gave Commorragh its impossible scale are now either sealed off from the rest or have drifted into conditions that make resettlement impractical. The Webway that connects what remains of the Dark City to the rest of the network is less robust than it was before the disjunction, and the Drukhari who maintain those connections are doing so with the awareness that additional failures are possible. The Necrons continue to activate Dolmen Gates. The Thousand Suns and other Chaos Space Marine warbands continue to use the Webway as a route toward the Black Library, and the battles they fight in the passages on the way leave damage that is incompletely repaired. The Great Rift continues to exert its effect on the dimensional stability of the space between real space and the warp, and the sealed sections accumulate more time, more accumulated pressure from whatever is inside them, more potential energy behind the seals that are, in many cases, the oldest intact structures the Eldari have maintained since the fall. Section 12. Why nobody goes there. The final answer: we have come a long way. From the old ones and the creation of the most extraordinary structure in the galaxy's history, through the war in heaven and the fall and the Emperor's broken dream and the secret war, beneath the Imperial Palace and the Great Rift, and 60 million years of accumulated damage. Through the creatures and entities that fill the damaged passages, the sealed doors and their unknown contents, the powerful beings who were lost and never returned. Yes, and the present moment where the network is in its worst condition since the event that broke it. The question was, why does nobody explore the deep Webway? The first part of the answer is that some beings do. The Harlequins move through it with more freedom and confidence than anyone, guided by the accumulated knowledge of a trickster god who knows every path in the network and whose disciples have refined their navigation techniques through centuries of direct experience. The Drukhari occasionally push the boundaries of what they control, extending the Dark City's reach into sections that were not previously considered accessible. Individual farseers, certain Harlequin solitaires, and extremely rare humans with enough knowledge and enough desperation have ventured into the labyrinth's deeper reaches because they believed they had to, or believed they had found something there worth the cost of the attempt. But systematic exploration, organized survey, comprehensive mapping of what is in each sealed section, assessment of whether any of it could be recovered or used, does not happen. And the reasons are worth sitting with rather than summarizing. The beings best positioned to explore are the beings who understand most clearly what exploration would mean. The Harlequins know the Webway better than anyone alive. Their judgment about what should be left sealed is not the judgment of beings who are afraid to look. It is the judgment of beings who have looked, who have sent members of their own ranks into sections that nobody else would enter, who have developed their ritual responses to what they found through centuries of painful and costly experience, and who have concluded that the contents of the sealed sections are not recoverable assets, but permanent hazards. They are not incurious. They are correctly cautious about what curiosity, without adequate preparation and knowledge, produces, in an environment that is specifically and comprehensively suited to killing things that are not adequately prepared. The environment itself resists exploration in ways that go beyond ordinary hostile terrain. The deep Webway is not dangerous in the way that a hostile jungle or a radioactive zone is dangerous, where the hazards are finite, accessible, and can be managed with the right equipment and preparation. Its dangers include temporal distortions that make cause and effect unreliable, spatial anomalies that make navigation impossible without extremely specific knowledge, entities that have been in their territory longer than any existing civilization has existed, and which have developed an expert familiarity with that territory, and structural failures that can occur without warning and drop a traveller into the warp directly rather than merely into a dangerous passage. An expedition that entered the deep Webway planning for the hazards they knew about would be surprised, repeatedly, by hazards they did not know about, in ways that their planning could not accommodate because the hazards were specifically of the kind that resist advanced assessment. If exploration succeeded, as the success itself would raise difficult questions, if a team found an old Eldari port city in some survivable state, if they found intact passages that could be restored and used, knowledge preserved in architecture or records that could be extracted and applied, then the questions that follow are not straightforward. The post-fall Eldari have been making hard choices for 60,000 years about what to preserve and what to sacrifice, and the specific nature of those choices has been shaped by the reality of what they have, rather than by grief for what they lost. Opening sealed sections that contain the remnants of what was lost risks reopening wounds that have been managed, not healed, but managed through the simple practical discipline of not engaging with them directly. And if the investigation triggers a new breach, you releases something that was contained, spreads damage to sections that had been intact, the cost of that discovery falls on every being that still relies on the Webway for survival. There is also a dimension of this that is harder to articulate, but perhaps the most honest. The deep Webway is a place where a civilization died. Not died in the abstract, not died in the way that every civilization eventually dies through gradual transformation and replacement. The Eldari Empire died in the deep Webway in the same moment that it died everywhere else. The shockwave of the fall hit the tunnels and destroyed them simultaneously with destroying everything above. The damage in the deep passages is not metaphorical. It is the literal, physical record of the moment in which everything ended. Every cracked wall is a record of the moment the psychic shielding failed. Every sealed door marks the place where someone made the last possible decision. Seal this. Save what remains of the passage beyond. Accept the loss of what is inside, in the hours and days and years after the event that defined them forever as survivors of something that could not be survived completely. To explore the deep Webway thoroughly would be to walk through grief made into architecture, to encounter not the glory of what was, but the specific and detailed record of how it ended. This is not nothing. This is not sentiment that can be set aside for practical investigation. For the beings whose civilization it was, the sealed sections are not simply storage spaces containing unknown hazards, because they are the unexamined rooms of a life that was ended before it should have been, and opening them means deciding to look at everything that was in those rooms when the door closed, which is a decision with consequences that cannot be fully predicted and cannot be undone. The deep webway holds its silence. The harlequins dance around it, performing the story of what was lost with all the skill and beauty and terrible precision of beings who have made the grief itself into an art form. The farseers read its edges with the careful attention of those who know that what is behind the walls has not stopped changing. And somewhere in the deepest part of the labyrinth, behind doors sealed with the most powerful wards that a species of millions of years standing could devise, whatever has been accumulating since the age of gods presses very gently against the lock and waits. It has been waiting for a very long time. It is not in any particular hurry. Closing. The map that no one has seen. There is one last thing worth mentioning, and it is this. There is a map. The lore speaks of a trans-dimensional chart, a master map of the entire Webway network, made thousands of years ago and now held in the Black Library. It shows every route, the intact passages, the sealed sections, the deep bones of the Old One construction, the places where time runs backward, the locations of every door and the runes that maintain it. When Inquisitor Chevak possessed a copy of this map, a version called the Atlas Infernal, with veins and capillaries that could reconfigure themselves to show the reader their desired destination, kept alive by a pump embedded in the spine. The Aeldari who gave it to him warned that it was no longer entirely accurate. It showed routes that had since been lost, and may have omitted some that had since been created. But it was the closest thing to a complete picture of the Webway that any human had ever held. What the original version in the Black Library shows. Whether it has been updated to reflect the 10,000 years of additional damage since its initial creation, whether it includes records of the Great Rift's effects, whether it maps the temporal dimensions as well as the spatial ones, is unknown. The Harlequins who guard that map are not forthcoming about its contents to those who have not earned the right to see them. Segarak knows every path, and the library holds as much of that knowledge as can be committed to a form that beings less than divine can use. The map contains the location of every sealed door, the description of every deep section's known contents, as of the time the records were made, the routes to the temporal anomalies, the paths to sections that no other living being knows how to reach, the knowledge of what the Old One sections at the deepest heart of the network are actually for, if anyone in the Eldari scholarly tradition ever determined that. Maybe in those deep sections, there are things that could be used, routes to locations that would change the balance of power in the current era, knowledge that could address the crisis of the Great Rift, or the threat of chaos, or the doom of the Eldari that She Who Thirsts represents. But the Webway was built by the most advanced civilization the galaxy has ever produced, and it is possible that some of what they built is still intact, still functional, waiting in the dark for someone with the knowledge and the courage and the specific kind of recklessness that very dangerous situations sometimes require. Or maybe the sealed sections contain exactly what they appear to contain, the accumulated consequence of every catastrophe the Webway has endured, organized by time and conditions into something that has no safe way of being approached. Maybe the most optimistic, reasonable assessment of the deep Webway's contents is that it is simply too dangerous to be useful to any currently existing civilization, whatever wonders it might theoretically contain. The Harlequins dance either way. But their dance does not require the answer to this question. It requires only the understanding that the question exists, that it has always existed, and that the laughing God who knows every path is laughing not because the answer is funny, but because the fact of the question, the sheer, vast, galaxy-spanning scale of what is unknown and sealed and lost and waiting, is the most remarkable thing in the universe. And maybe that is the right way to end, not with an answer, but with the shape of the question, not with a key, but with an appreciation for the size of the door. Thank you so much for being here and for taking this journey through one of the most extraordinary and haunting corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Webway is a place I find endlessly fascinating, precisely because it holds within it so much of what makes this setting great. The weight of ancient history, the tragedy of things that could have been otherwise, the quiet horror of doors that nobody opens because everyone agrees, for very good reasons, that they should stay shut. If you found something in this that moved you, or that made you see the Webway differently, if you felt even a little of what I feel when I spend time in this particular corner of the lore, then please do consider subscribing to Q on 40k and leave a like on this video so that more people who love this universe as much as you do can find their way here. Every person who joins this community is someone to explore the lore with, and I genuinely treasure that. Until the next one, walk carefully wherever you are going, keep your eyes open, your seals maintained, and whatever you find in the darks, sealed doors are sealed for a reason. Leave them that way. Appendix: the wandering halls. Places within the deep that have names. There are locations within the deep Webway that have been encountered briefly by those few beings who ventured into the compromised passages and survived to describe what they found. These are not intact destinations in any useful sense, not places that can be returned to with confidence, because the Webway's spatial and temporal instability means that what was found in a given location during one expedition may not be findable in the same form or even the same place during a subsequent one, but they have names, and the names carry within them a compressed account of the nature of what was there. The Shattered Amphitheatre is the informal name given to a location encountered by a Harlequin scouting party. Exact date not recorded in accessible sources, that stumbled through a compromised passage into a space that should not have existed within the tunnel geometry. It was a vast open area, far larger than the tunnel it was accessed from, in the way that Webway subrealms can be larger than the passages connecting to them. The architecture was Aeldari of the pre-fall style, but damaged in patterns that suggested not the mechanical destruction of the fall's shockwave, but something more deliberate and more gradual. The seating rose in concentric rings around a central performance space whose floor was still partially intact. But the surviving records describe the psychic residue of the space as almost physical in its intensity, the echo of something that had been performed there many times for many thousands of years, preserved in the walls and the stone and the crystalline material of the seats, with a fidelity that made the witnesses experience fragments of those performances involuntarily as they moved through the space. What was performed in that amphitheatre, what arts were practiced in a space that sat at the heart of a civilization's most hedonistic period, are details that the witnesses were not forthcoming about in their reports. The space was sealed. The passage leading to it was closed. What remains in the amphitheatre, if the amphitheatre still exists in a fixed location, is the echo of whatever it witnessed. Whilst the Hall of the Unmoving is a section of the deep Webway that was discovered not by exploration, but by accident, when a Webway gate that had been believed non-functional spontaneously opened during a routine passage maintenance operation. The gate connected to a corridor whose walls were covered in what appeared to be imagery, psychically encoded murals of a kind that the early Eldari Empire used for record-keeping and commemorative architecture. But the murals depicted events in a sequence that did not correspond to any known historical chronology. Events that the witnesses recognized from historical records appeared in the wrong order. Battles that should have preceded their causes appeared after them. The overall effect, as described by the witnesses, was of a historical record that had been assembled from the perspective of someone experiencing time in multiple directions simultaneously, perhaps a scholar operating from the location known as Uijabialak, the place in the Webway where time runs backward, compiling records that seemed rational from their temporal vantage point, but that are entirely disorienting to beings experiencing time in the conventional direction. The passage was resealed. The gate that had opened it was destroyed to prevent any further spontaneous activation. The Garden of Ending Sounds is a section that several independent sources have mentioned in terms suggesting it is relatively well known within the narrow community of beings who navigate the deep webway with any regularity. And so the description is consistent across sources, a subrealm accessible from a specific sequence of passages whose exact location shifts between visits, containing an environment that is biologically alive in ways that the rest of the deep webway is not. There are plants, crystalline, psychically active organisms that grow from the webway's walls and floor and ceiling in formations that suggest to the sufficiently perceptive observer deliberate cultivation. These plants produce sounds, not randomly, in response to movement through the space, in patterns that change depending on who is moving through them. The sounds are described as profoundly affecting, beautiful, in reports from those who pass through the garden without incident. Other reports describe them differently, as sounds that extracted something from the listener. Well, that left those who had heard them feeling that some component of their memory or identity had been gently removed during the passage, like a library from which specific books had been carefully withdrawn while leaving the shelving intact. Whether these two sets of reports describe the same place at different times, or different places misidentified as the same, or the same place that produces different effects on different visitors, is not clear. The garden has not been definitively sealed, which is itself unusual for something that produces effects this unusual. The corridor of the sealed gods is not a formal designation, but the informal name given by a human inquisitor, Bronislaw Chevak, whose encounters with the webway's deep sections are referenced repeatedly in the accessible literature to a section of the network he passed through during his decades within the labyrinth. He described it as an arterial passage of extraordinary width and height, large enough that void ships could have sailed through it in the era when such passages were used for that purpose, whose walls were covered floor to ceiling with seals, not simple runes or wards, but complex, multi-layered psychic constructions of evident enormous power, each one unique, each one apparently sealing something within the wall itself, rather than sealing a door or passage. What the seals were containing, whether entities or knowledge or memories or processes, or something for which none of these categories are appropriate, Chevak could not determine and did not attempt to determine more closely. He noted that the seals appeared active, maintained by some power source he could not identify, and that several of them appeared to be flickering, not failing exactly, but varying in intensity in ways that might, in a sufficiently long time frame, become relevant. He passed through the corridor of the sealed gods as quickly as his navigation of the surrounding passages permitted, and did not attempt a return visit. The mirror passages. These are described in the most ancient Harlequin accounts of deep webway navigation, and are believed to be Old One construction rather than Aeldari. Also, they are passages in which the tunnel walls are composed of a material that functions as a reflective surface, but does not reflect the viewer in the expected way. Instead, the surfaces appear to show the viewer at different points in time, past versions, in most cases, the viewer younger, and in contexts that may correspond to actual memories or may be generated by the passage itself in ways that are indistinguishable from memory. Some accounts describe the mirror walls as showing future versions, which is more disturbing and considerably less useful than the past-showing variant. The Harlequins who have navigated the mirror passages successfully describe the key technique as refusing to engage with what the walls show, maintaining complete focus on the passage geometry and the navigation requirements, whilst treating the walls as irrelevant regardless of what appears in them. Those who did not manage this complete non-engagement are not available to describe the alternative outcomes, which is itself a fairly comprehensive description of the consequences. These named locations are the fragments of a much larger geography, the parts of the deep webway that have been encountered and survived and described. For every location that has a name, there are thousands or millions of sections that have been sealed without investigation, sealed during emergencies, sealed by the automated processes of the webway's self-repair mechanisms when a breach was detected, sealed by entities within the network itself using techniques that nobody fully understands. The deep webway is vast. The named locations are points on a map that is mostly blank. as in a space that is mostly unmapped, in a structure that is mostly sealed against the kind of investigation that would fill in the blanks. Appendix. The question of the Great Khan, Jagatai Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars, deserves more time than the passing reference earlier in this script, because his story is one of the most poignant examples in the lore of what the deep Webway takes and does not return. The Great Khan was among the most mobile-minded of the Emperor's sons, a being whose philosophy of warfare was built around movement, speed, the principle that the ability to be somewhere unexpected at the decisive moment was worth any tactical sacrifice, that a force that could not be fixed could not be destroyed. He was also, by the nature of his role as Primarch of a Space Marine Legion, as an enormously powerful individual whose physical and psychic capabilities far exceeded those of any ordinary warrior. The White Scars had a particular history with the Dark Eldar, whose practice of raiding inhabited worlds for slaves and the psychic energy their suffering produced had brought them into conflict with the Legion on multiple occasions. The Dark Eldar were, in a specific and practical sense, experts in using the Webway as a tactical advantage, entering real space through Webway portals, conducting raids, and returning through the portals before any conventional response could be organized, exploiting the network's speed in ways that made pursuit almost impossible for anyone who did not have access to the same network. The Khan pursued them, but the exact circumstances are not fully preserved in accessible records. The exact battle, the exact provocation, the specific chain of decisions that led a Primarch to follow his enemies into the Webway, rather than accepting that their retreat made them unreachable. But the White Scars believed that he entered the labyrinth dimension in pursuit of Dark Eldar forces, and was drawn deeper than he intended to go. Whether this was a trap deliberately laid, or the consequence of his own navigation leading him into sections of the network that were not what they appeared, or some combination of both, is not clear. 10,000 years later, the White Scars still light candles for their Primarch and speak of him as alive. This is not simply denial or wishful thinking. The Primarchs are beings of extraordinary durability, and the Webway, just while deeply hostile, is not the warp. A Primarch surviving in the Webway for 10,000 years is at least theoretically possible in ways that would not be true for an ordinary human being. But surviving and being findable are different things. Surviving and being recoverable are different things. And surviving in a space where time does not behave consistently, in passages whose contents and configurations change between visits, in a labyrinth where even the most knowledgeable navigators acknowledge that some sections lead only to further sections that lead only to further sections without ever reaching anything outside, is a form of survival that may not meaningfully differ from loss. The Dark Eldar, who are associated with the Khan's disappearance, are, according to White Scar's tradition, cursed by the Legion's continued imprecations against them. Whether this is metaphorical or has any practical consequence is not clear from the available sources. What is clear is that the White Scars have never stopped looking, in the sense that they still enter the Webway when they have reasons to do so, and still keep the specific passages associated with their Primarch's disappearance as active areas of interest in their chapter's intelligence operations. The Great Khan, if he still lives in the deep Webway, is experiencing something that no surviving account can fully describe. The Webway's temporal effects in the damaged sections mean that 10,000 years of subjective experience may not correspond to 10,000 years of real space-time. He may have experienced much more than that, or much less, depending on which passages he has travelled and which temporal conditions they have imposed on him. He may have encountered things that have no names in any language currently spoken. He may have found passages that the Harlequins do not know about, or sealed sections that were sealed long enough ago that even Segarak's knowledge of them is theoretical rather than practical. Or he may have found something else. The deep Webway contains, according to the deepest levels of the available lore, secrets that the old ones embedded in its structure and never revealed to their successors. The routes to the temporal dimensions, the interfaces with whatever the Webway's deeper function is in the full structure of the universe, the places where even the Harlequin's knowledge becomes uncertain, just where the laughing god's omniscience of the network's paths encounters passages that may lead outside the webway entirely, into something adjacent to it, something connected to it, something that was planned by its builders for a purpose that no one who came after them ever understood. If Jagatai Khan, with his extraordinary intelligence and the survival skills of a being who has trained for combat in every possible environment, has been navigating the deep webway for 10 millennia, it is not impossible that he knows things about it that nobody else knows, that he has found things that nobody else has found, that whatever he has become in 10,000 years of exposure to that most extreme and unusual of environments, he is not what he was when he entered. The white scars maintain their candles. The deep webway maintains its silence. At the question of whether those two things are in contact with each other at all is one that only the most optimistic or the most faithful would confidently answer either way. Appendix: the webway and the Great Rift, a structure becoming unmanageable, the formation of the cicatrix maledictum, the Great Rift, is, for the webway, the most significant single event since the fall itself. This requires some unpacking because the Great Rift's effects on real space are already well documented and dramatic enough that the additional effects on the webway can seem like secondary damage. They are not. They are, in some ways, more consequential for the long-term future of the network than the real space effects are for the Imperium, because the webway does not have the Imperium's capacity for institutional adaptation to catastrophe, whilst the Great Rift is a galaxy-spanning warp rift of unprecedented scale. Its formation involved contributions from multiple catastrophic events: the fall of Cadia, the sorceries of Magnus the Red during the Fenris campaign, the cascading failures of a galaxy under existential pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. In the warp, its formation was felt as the most significant restructuring of that dimension since the Eye of Terror opened at the fall. In real space, it was expressed as a tear across the galaxy, a permanent storm of unreality that cut off entire sectors from each other and unleashed warp energies in ways that the Imperium's infrastructure was not designed to handle. In the webway, it was felt as the near-simultaneous failure of dimensional stability across vast sections of the network. Yet the webway sits in the space between real space and the warp, a galaxy-scale restructuring of the warp that is one of the two surfaces against which the webway presses, is felt by the entire webway simultaneously, not as a localized event, but as a systemic shock. The analogy is not perfect, but imagine pressing a book between two shelves, and then having one of the shelves suddenly shift a meter to the left. The book is not the shelf. The book is not where the force is being applied, but the book is going to be affected in ways that depend entirely on how well built and how worn it was before the shelf moved. The webway, already a structure that was significantly worn before the Great Rift formed, experienced the rift's formation as a series of failures that cascaded through the network faster than the Eldari's self-repair mechanisms could address. Closed gates blew open. The seals on sections that had been carefully maintained for thousands of years failed, suddenly and without warning, at multiple locations simultaneously. Stable subrealms that had been passable since before the heresy became unstable and began oscillating between accessible and warp-exposed conditions on timescales that made navigation through them a game of dimensional roulette. And the sections that were already compromised became more compromised, with the additional warp pressure finding every existing weakness and exploiting it with the relentless efficiency of a force that has no agenda beyond expansion. The Harlequins mobilized. Yet there is no more precise way to describe it. The masks that had been dispersed across the galaxy suddenly moved with apparent coordination towards specific locations in the webway, as if Kegarak had sent a galactic message simultaneously to all of them that was comprehensible to his followers in ways that nobody outside the Harlequins could decode. What they did at those locations, what they sealed or reinforced or sacrificed to address the most critical failures, is not described in sources accessible to general scholars. What is described is the result, a network that survived the Great Rift's formation in a condition worse than before, but still navigable in its primary routes, still connected between the major craftworld access points, still maintaining the essential infrastructure of the Aeldari's continued existence. Just the cost was high. Sections that had been marginal before the Great Rift became definitively lost, sealed with new wards over their already existing seals, double locked against whatever the Rift's formation had introduced or enlarged within them. Routes that had been usable but cautiously were reclassified as impassable and sealed. The post-Rift Webway is smaller than the pre-Rift Webway, its usable portion reduced by the same kind of accounting that has reduced it repeatedly throughout its history. And the things inside the sealed sections that were newly compromised by the Rift's formation, they now have more room, more connection to the warp, more energy, more time, in which to become whatever they are going to become in the centuries and millennia that follow. The Great Rift did not simply damage the Webway's structure. Should it improve the conditions for whatever inhabits its damaged sections, and it opened new passages between sealed regions and the active network, passages whose existence was detected and resealed as quickly as possible, but whose existence for any length of time at all means that migration between regions was, however briefly, possible. What moved during those windows of connection? What travelled from sections sealed since the fall into sections sealed since the heresy, or from sections sealed since the heresy into sections that are still actively used? What found the connections between damaged sections and intact ones and explored them before the seals went back up? The answers are not available, and the Aeldari's surveys of the network following the Great Rift's formation, such as they are, provide fragmentary information rather than a comprehensive accounting. The Webway in the era of the Great Rift is a structure that is being managed by beings who are increasingly overwhelmed by the scale of what needs managing. The craft world Aeldari have fewer resources proportionally than they had during the fall, when they were already depleted from the catastrophe they had just survived. The Dark Eldar are occupied with the internal politics of a city that was shaken to its foundations and has not fully recovered. The Harlequins are more active than they have been in recent memory, but the scale of the network and the scale of the damage means that even the most active and knowledgeable navigators in existence can only be present in so many places simultaneously. The deep Webway, and already the domain of everything that could not be managed during the 10,000 years of relative stability that followed the heresy, is now larger, more connected to itself, and more energized than it was before the rift formed. The sealed doors are under more pressure, the things behind them are more active, and the beings responsible for keeping those doors sealed are facing a galaxy that is, simultaneously, demanding their attention and resources in every other direction as well. The Webway endures. It has endured everything so far. Whether it can continue to endure everything that is coming is a question whose answer, in the grim darkness of this far future, does not seem likely to be a comfortable one. A final meditation on 60 million years of silence. 60 million years. Whilst the number comes up repeatedly in this story because it is the age of the Webway's oldest damage, and I want to end this telling by sitting with that number for a moment rather than passing through it. 60 million years ago, the dominant large animals on Earth were not mammals. The mass extinction event that would end the age of the great reptiles was 30 million years in the future. The continents were in arrangements different from the current ones. The sky looked different. The chemical composition of the atmosphere was meaningfully different. Nothing that would have been recognizable to a modern human as a familiar animal or plant existed yet. The universe was 60 million years younger, which is a small fraction of the universe's total age, but an enormous fraction of anything's history on the timescale of life on a single planet. In the deep Webway, there are sections that have been isolated from the rest of the network for that entire span of time. The seals that closed them were placed by beings whose civilization would itself end millions of years later. What was inside those sections when they were sealed has had 60 million years of isolation in which to change, to develop, to become whatever it was going to become in the absence of any outside influence or observation. The conditions inside a warp-contaminated section of hyperdimensional tunnel with 60 million years of unobserved development are not the conditions that any existing bestiary any existing scholarly framework, where any existing theory of demonology or dimensional physics was designed to describe. This is not a problem that can be addressed by being braver or better armed or more knowledgeable about conventional threats. It is a problem that requires confronting the possibility that the contents of those sections have become something genuinely outside the categories available to any living being, not merely dangerous, but differently constituted from everything that has been encountered and survived and categorized before. The Webway was built by beings whose understanding of the universe was more advanced than anything currently available. The damage done to it has been sustained by forces that include two Chaos Gods' participation and the structural effects of a galaxy-spanning warp rift. What lives in the intersection of those two facts, Old One construction, chaos damage, 60 million years of development, is genuinely, substantively unknown in ways that go beyond the ordinary admission of incomplete information. The Harlequins know more than anyone. They are still dancing. The dance continues, because it must, because the universe does not give anyone the option of stopping just because the thing you are facing is very large and very old and very thoroughly beyond your complete understanding. You dance, because that is what you do. You keep moving, because stopping is worse. You keep the doors sealed, because opening them is worse. And you laugh, because the laughing God who knows every path has chosen laughter over despair, which may be the most profound and specific wisdom that the 41st millennium has to offer. Well, thank you for walking this road with me. The Webway holds its silence, and somewhere in the deep, behind 60 million years of sealed doors, the galaxy's oldest mysteries wait. On why the Aeldari guard it so jealously, there is one more question worth addressing before we close entirely, and it is this. Why do the Aeldari guard the Webway so jealously? Not merely the sealed sections, which everyone agrees should be sealed, but the usable sections, the intact routes, the maintained passages, the functioning gates. Why do they resist sharing access with other species? Why does the Imperium, which has 10,000 Space Marine chapters and the largest standing military force in galactic history, still have no meaningful access to the network? Why does humanity, as which had 10,000 years to develop alternate access methods after the Emperor's great work failed, still travel through the warp? The straightforward answer is that the Eldari are protective of their most critical remaining resource, and that sharing access with humanity would mean sharing access with beings who do not understand the network well enough to use it safely, who would damage sections through careless navigation, open passages that should stay closed, introduce problems that the Aeldari would then have to address. There is truth in this. The history of human interaction with the Webway is not encouraging. The Emperor's tunnels brought demons into the network. Magnus's folly damaged sections that had been intact for thousands of years. Every unauthorized human incursion into the labyrinthine dimension has, without exception, either ended badly for the humans or ended badly for the Webway, or both. But the deeper answer is existential. The Webway is not simply the Aeldari's primary transport infrastructure. It is, for the post-fall Aeldari, their primary survival mechanism. Without the Webway, the craft-world Aeldari cannot move their forces between their far-flung homes with the speed their military and political organization requires. Without the Webway, the Drukari cannot raid real space and return. They become stranded in their sub-realms, which is an existential problem for a species that requires the psychic energy of suffering to sustain their stolen lives. Without the Webway, the Harlequins cannot fulfill their function as the network's guardians and messengers and performers, or cannot move between the locations that their role in the galaxy requires. For a species that already numbers only in the millions, already teetering on the edge of extinction, already defined by the fact that a single catastrophic loss could tip them into irreversible demographic collapse, the Webway is the infrastructure of survival itself. Sharing it with a species that numbers in the trillions, whose military resources vastly exceed anything the Eldari can field, whose leadership is simultaneously capable of recognizing the Webway's value and incapable of managing it safely, is not an acceptable risk. The Eldari have already watched one civilization destroy itself and take the Webway half down with it. They are not going to give humanity the opportunity to be a second chapter of the same story. Which this is also why the deep sections matter so specifically. The sealed sections are not just storage rooms. They represent, potentially, the margin between the Eldari's survival and their extinction. If the Webway's degradation continues, if each generation of crises reduces the usable network further, if the Great Rift's effects compound over the next few centuries, if the sealed sections continue to contaminate their neighbors through the gradual failure of aging wards, then there comes a point at which the surviving roots are too few and too fragile to sustain an interstellar civilization of even the Eldari's modest remaining scale. The deep sections are the reserve in this dark accounting. They are the tunnels that might, under the right circumstances and with the right knowledge, be restored to usability and extend the Webway's functional life by another few thousand years. Whether those circumstances will ever exist, whether that knowledge is available or can be developed, whether the beings required to perform that work will survive long enough to attempt it, these are questions that every Eldari farseer with a long enough view horizon thinks about, and none of them think about with optimism. The Webway is dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but by the slow and steady attrition of irreplaceable infrastructure that is losing more to each new crisis than it gains back during the periods of relative stability between crises. The deep sections are the record of everything already lost. The intact sections are the record of everything not yet lost. And the sealed doors are the line between the two, maintained with everything available for as long as anything is available to maintain them. This is what it means to inherit the galaxy's greatest structure when you are the remnant of the civilization that built it. Not pride, not mastery, a responsibility so heavy and so old that it has shaped everything about you. Your caution, your secrecy, your jealousy, your longevity, your strange and terrible beauty. You guard the doors because it is the only thing left to do. And you keep the keys, because losing them would mean losing everything. 60 million years of sealed passages, millions of years of history behind every ruined corridor, the ghosts of a civilization in every shattered tunnel, and in the deep, the silence that has no end. I was on the Harlequins' endless vigil, the keepers of the last map. The Harlequins are, in every meaningful sense, the caretakers of what remains of the Webway's memory. Not merely its current routes and intact passages. Those are maintained by the craftworld Eldari and their technical knowledge of gate maintenance and tunnel repair. What the Harlequins preserve is the memory of the complete structure, what it was, what it contained, where the deep sections lie and what they held, what the sealed doors were sealed against and when and by whom, and what specific psychic techniques were used to construct the wards that keep them closed. This knowledge is not stored in any single document or archive. It is embodied knowledge, carried in the performance traditions of the Harlequins themselves, encoded in their dances, and their theatrical cycles, and the specific symbolism of their masks, the dance without end. Their most sacred and most complex performance is not merely a retelling of the fall of the Eldari. It is a mnemonic system, a memory palace expressed as movement in which the complete map of the Webway, including every route, every sealed section, every location that matters in the network's full geography, is encoded in choreographic sequences that take years to learn and lifetimes to fully master. This is why the Harlequins guard the Black Library so carefully. The library contains the written record of what the dance contains in embodied form, the archive version of the Webway's complete map, supplemented by thousands of years of expedition records, scholarly analysis of the Old One construction sections, your observations about the temporal anomalies, catalogued encounters with whatever was found in the sections that could be entered and survived. The library and the dance together constitute the most complete record of the Webway that exists. Neither is comprehensible without context for the other. Together, they represent the inheritance of a civilization 60 million years old, maintained by a group of beings who simultaneously fight and perform and navigate the galaxy's most dangerous road. This is also why the death of a Harlequin solitaire, particularly one of the ancient ones, the most experienced navigators who have spent centuries in the deep passages, is not just a personal loss. It is a loss of irreplaceable knowledge. A solitaire who has navigated the deep webway for 500 years and survived carries, out in their accumulated experience and refined technique, information about the passages they have travelled that exists nowhere else in any external record. When they die, that information dies with them unless it has been passed down or encoded in one of the mnemonic performance traditions. The Harlequins treat this mortality not with resignation, but with the specific urgency of beings who understand that every death is a small subtraction from the total knowledge available to maintain the most important structure in the known galaxy. The laughing god watches and laughs and knows every path. His disciples dance and remember and hold the doors. The deep webway waits, as it has always waited, for whatever comes next in a story that has been unfolding for longer than most civilizations have existed. In the grim darkness of the far future, as there is only war, but there is also this, the last custodians of the galaxy's oldest road, keeping their vigil, maintaining their seals, dancing the memory of what was into the uncertain future that remains. That may not be enough. It is what there is.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.